A police dog broke training and pulled her into the snow, to a dying man left under a tree. No one was meant to find him, or to care. But the broken stranger in the snow was a seal his country used up and threw away. The men who left him there never dreamed he'd help an agent burn their empire down. Stay to the end, and remember the ones the world forgot. The road into the Beckley Hills narrowed with every mile until the blacktop gave up and turned to packed gravel and old snow. Dana Pruitt kept both hands on the wheel and let the headlights do the talking. They found a leaning mailbox, a fence with half its teeth gone, a dog chain frozen to a porch step with no dog at the end of it. Out here, the houses sat far apart, the way people do when a place has been hurt enough times to learn the value of distance. She was 29, and she had grown up 2 counties east, close enough that the cold still smelled like childhood. Wood smoke, wet pine, the iron tang of a creek running under ice. People assumed the FBI sent her here because she knew the terrain. They were right, though not in the way they meant. She knew what these hills did to the men who came home from far away, and found that nobody had kept a place for them. In the back seat, Rook shifted his weight and let out a low breath through his nose. He was 4 years old, a German shepherd with a coat the color of burnt coffee and a black saddle across his back. And he sat the way he always did on a drive, upright, ears half-mast, watching the dark slide past the window like it owed him something. Dual-purpose dog. He could find a man in a collapsed building and put a man on the ground in the same afternoon, and he treated both jobs with the same flat patience. The case that brought them here had started with a single handgun. It had turned up at a crime scene 300 miles away in Philadelphia, and Dana had done what she always did, which was pull the thread and keep pulling. The serial number led back to a federally licensed dealer down near Beckley. The dealer's paperwork led to a Form 4473, the one-page federal form where a buyer signs his name and swears in writing that the gun is for himself and no one else. The name on the line was Eli Hartman. The address was the one her headlights were crawling toward now. The bureau was in it because the smell of the thing went past guns and into something worse, the kind of rot where the people meant to stop the bleeding are the ones holding the knife. The firearms end belonged to ATF. The corruption end belonged to her. The house, when she reached it, looked like it had stopped expecting visitors a long time ago. One window glowed faint behind a curtain. The rest were dark. She parked, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the ticking quiet, reading the place the way Rook read the window, slowly, without trust. She knocked. She waited. She knocked again and said her name and her business to a door that gave her nothing back. When she tried the handle, it turned. Inside, the air was colder than outside, which told her the heat had been off for hours. A single lamp burned in the front room over a recliner with a blanket thrown back, as if someone had risen in a hurry and not returned. A wheelchair stood folded against the wall. A coffee cup sat on the floor beside the chair, tipped, the stain long dry. Some part of her wanted to write it up and go. The man wasn't home. She could come back in daylight with a colleague and a warrant and do it clean. That was the smart play, and she knew it, and she was already turning toward the door when she let Rook out of the cruiser to stretch. And the dog changed. He did not bark. He put his nose to the snow at the base of the porch steps and went still in a way that wasn't stillness at all, but the opposite, every muscle in him gathering toward something. His hackles lifted in a ridge from his shoulders to his tail. When she said heel, low and automatic, he did not come. In 4 years, he had never once not come. He pulled instead, hard, toward the black wall of trees behind the house, and the leash burned through her glove before she got her feet under her. There was a drag mark in the snow. She saw it only when the dog's body pointed straight down its length. 2 long furrows, heel deep, the kind a body makes when it isn't walking but being moved, and between them the scuffed prints of more than one set of boots that hadn't cared who saw them come or go. Whatever scent rode that trail, She couldn't catch a thread of it. The dog had it whole. He followed it the way water follows the lowest ground, certain and without doubt, into the dark under the pines where the snow lay blue and untouched, and the cold pressed in from every side. She found him at the foot of an old oak, where the branches had kept the worst of the snow off and left a hollow of frozen leaves. A man, folded in on himself against the trunk, one leg stretched out at an angle a leg doesn't choose. He wasn't moving. For a breath she was sure she had come too late, that the hills had taken another one, and she had arrived only in time to learn his name. Then Rook pressed his whole body against the man's side and held there, and the man's chest rose, barely, a shallow lift under a thin jacket soaked through, and his eyes opened to slits, soulful and unfocused, searching for the source of the warmth. She went down on her knees in the snow. She got her coat off and over him, and her hands moving, the way she'd been trained, checking what she could check, talking the whole time in the low, steady voice you use on the badly hurt and the half-frozen, telling him help was coming, telling him to stay, telling him a name she didn't yet know was his. His skin was the temperature of the ground. One hand wouldn't close. She called it in with her shoulder, pinning the phone to her ear, reciting coordinates she had to guess at, while the dog lay the length of him and gave him the only heat for a mile. The wait was long. Cold like that doesn't take a person all at once. It does it quietly, by degrees, the way the world lets a thing be forgotten, not in a single act of cruelty, but in 1,000 small turnings away. She kept her hands on him and her eyes on the dark, and she did not let either go. When the ambulance finally came, its lights threw red across the snow and turned the trees into a moving crowd of shadows. The medics lifted him onto the board, and the man's eyes came open wider, fixing on her face as if it were the only fixed thing left. His good hand found her wrist and closed around it with a strength that had no business in a body that spent. His lips moved. She leaned in to hear over the engine and the wind. "I told them I was done," he said. The words came out cracked, scraped down to nothing, but each one landed. "I'm not doing it anymore." Then they had him in the bay, and the doors were closing, and the lights were pulling away down the gravel, and Dana stood alone in the trampled snow, with the dog leaning hard against her leg, and her own coat gone, and the cold finding her now, too. She looked back at the drag marks, at the boots that had made them, at the house with its one burning lamp. The name on the form was Eli Hartman. The man on the board was Eli Hartman, and somewhere between the paper and the oak tree, those two things had become the same thing, and she understood, standing there, that she was no longer tracing a gun. She was tracing a man, and the people who had left him out here had counted on the hills to do their forgetting for them. They had him in a room on the 3rd floor by morning, wrapped in warming blankets with a line in his good arm and a monitor counting out the slow return of a body that had decided, against the odds, to stay. Dana sat in the chair by the window with a paper cup of coffee gone cold in her hands and watched him sleep, and she did not leave, though there were a dozen reasons she should have. Rook lay on the tile beside the bed, where the nurses had let him stay after the second time they tried to move him and failed. Eli Hartman looked smaller in the daylight than he had under the oak. The chart at the foot of the bed told her the parts a chart can tell. 39. Hypothermia, frostnip on 2 fingers, an old injury to the left leg and left arm that the intake nurse had noted and underlined. Prior service-connected, partial paralysis. The rest of him the chart could not hold. The way he had been folded under that tree like a thing set down and not picked back up. The house with its one lamp and its blanket thrown back, waiting on no one. When he woke, he did it the way soldiers wake, all at once and without sound, his eyes finding the ceiling, and then the room, and then her, and going hard for a moment before they understood she was not a threat. He tried to sit up. His left side did not come with him. He caught himself on the right elbow, and she watched him do a thing she would see him do 100 times after, shift his weight so the working half of him faced the world and the rest stayed turned away, a small, constant labor he had stopped noticing he performed. "You found me," he said. It wasn't a question. "My dog found you," Dana said. "I just followed." His eyes moved to Rook, and something in his face eased by a degree. "Good dog," he said, low, the way you'd say it to one you'd known a long time, and Rook's tail moved once against the tile. She told him who she was. She watched the badge land. Most people sat up straighter for it. He went the other way, sank back into the pillow like a man who had run out of road, and closed his eyes, and she understood that whatever he'd been afraid of out there, the law was tangled up in it somewhere. There was a stretch of quiet then, and into it he gave her the bones of himself, the way the badly hurt sometimes will, to a stranger, in a room that smells of antiseptic, because a stranger is safer than the people who are supposed to love you. Navy. A long time ago, and then, not so long. A mission he would not name, and a door that closed on the half of his body that used to work. A wife who had stayed through the surgeries and the rehab and the year of him learning to stand, and who had left in the end not at the worst of it, but after, when the worst was over and what remained was just the rest of their lives. No children. A check that came on the first of the month, and a house too far up the hollow for anyone to visit, which had suited him fine, he said, until it didn't. It was almost a third of the way into the morning, the light through the blinds gone from gray to a thin winter gold, when Dana rose to stretch her legs and stood at the window looking down at the parking lot. And she went still. A car sat at the far edge of the lot, nosed toward the building, in a slot no visitor would pick, too far from the doors, too close to the exit lane. Its lights were off. Its engine was not, she could tell, by the faint breath of exhaust rising pale into the cold. And in the dark of the cabin, low behind the wheel, a single point of orange brightened and dimmed and brightened again. The slow pull of a cigarette. Someone sitting in the cold with the heater running and the lights dead, not coming in, not leaving, his face a smudge behind the glass turned up toward the third floor, toward this row of windows. She did not move, and she did not look away, and after a long moment the orange point dropped and went dark, and the car still did not leave. She memorized the shape of it. She did not tell Eli. When she sat back down, her voice was easy, like nothing had moved in her at all. "Tell me about the form," she said. "The one with your name on it," he told her. There had been a foundation, Appalachian Valor, a name designed to sound like a hand on the shoulder. They came to the VA waiting room, to the food pantry, to the places the forgotten gather. A man who knew which questions to ask. Light work, good money, helping out veterans down on their luck, all of it legal, all of it paperwork. They drove him to a gun show 2 counties over. They told him which table, which model, and they put the cash in his pocket beforehand. He signed the Form 4473, the federal one where you swear the gun is yours. And he checked the box that said he was the actual buyer, and he was not, and he had known he was not, and he had needed the money more than he had needed to be a man who didn't do that. 3 times, he said. He was looking at the ceiling. 4th time I asked where the guns were going. They stopped explaining things to me after that. But the buys didn't stop. His good hand closed slowly on the blanket. I started getting calls. Dealers confirming pickups I never made. My name kept walking into rooms I wasn't in. People who run things on the backs of the desperate count on one thing above all others, that the desperate will be too tired, too ashamed, too alone to ever stand up and be counted. It is a safe bet. It is almost always a safe bet. "So you told them you were done," Dana said, "for all the good it did." He turned his head and looked at her, and there was no self-pity in it, only a tiredness that went down to the floor. "A name's easier to keep than a man." They didn't need me anymore. They just needed me to stay quiet up that hill. She thought about the drag marks, about the boots that hadn't cared who saw. Back at the field office that afternoon, she pulled the thread the way she'd pulled it on the gun, and the pattern came up out of the data like a face out of fog. Hartman wasn't one bad form. He was one of a column. She ran the buys against the VA rolls, and the names matched and matched and matched. A roster of the service-connected and the down-and-out, men and a few women whose clean records and whose uniforms had bought them a dealer's trust and bought somebody else a stockpile. The foundation hadn't been finding people to help. It had been harvesting them, picking the ones the system had already set down under a tree somewhere and left. One name sat near the bottom with a flag beside it. Becca Tilley, 23. Army, 2 years, honorable. A daughter, age 4. An address in a trailer court outside town, and a phone that had called an ATF tip line once, 11 days ago, and never called again. Dana sat with that name a long time. When she came back to the hospital that evening, Rook rose from the tile and went to the bed and lay down again with his spine pressed the length of Eli's good side, his chin on the man's thigh, the whole weight of him a deliberate thing. The dog had spent 4 years choosing no one. Dana watched him choose and said nothing, because some things you don't want to scare off by naming them. She was gathering her coat to go when the night nurse leaned in, clipboard against her chest, friendly and tired. "Oh, good, you're still here," the nurse said. "His family came by the desk a little while ago, asked which room. I told them visiting hours were over, but I said they could check back in the morning." She smiled. Nice of them to drive all this way. Dana stood very still with one arm in her coat. On the bed, Eli had gone the color of the sheets. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said the thing they both knew, which was that there was no family. There was no one to drive all this way. There was a man in a cold car with a cigarette and a roster full of forgotten names, and somewhere between the oak tree and this room he had learned that Eli Hartman was still breathing. She moved him before dawn, while the cold car in the lot sat empty, and the man behind the wheel had gone wherever such men go to sleep. A bureau safe house on the far side of the county, a low brick rental with the blinds drawn, and a marshal parked out front. And Eli went without argument, which somehow troubled her more than if he'd fought. He had spent so long being moved by other hands that he had stopped expecting to be asked. Rook rode with him. That had not been the plan, but the dog had planted himself at the door of the cruiser and looked back at her with an expression that left no room for discussion, and Dana had learned, over 4 years, when she was being overruled. The money was the part she trusted. People lie. Paper lies. But money has to go somewhere, and the somewhere leaves a track, and a track is a thing you can follow on your hands and knees until it leads you home. She spent 2 days at the field office with a financial analyst from the IRS criminal side and a map of accounts that grew across the whiteboard like frost across a window. The guns went north, bought in 1s and 2s at shows around Beckley, carried up the old road to Philadelphia, sold on corners for triple what the paper said they cost. And the money came back, not in a duffel. In 100 small, honest-looking pieces, run through the registers of a chain of pawn shops the way dirty water is run through sand. A loan, written and forgiven. A watch bought and never claimed. By the time the cash came out the far end, it had a clean face and a clean name, and the name, again and again, was a holding company that traced up through 2 shells to a single man. Calvin Stroud, pillar of the county. He owned the pawn shops and a car lot and a stake in half the storefronts on Main, and he sat on the board of a charity that put his picture in the paper twice a year, handing oversized checks to men in wheelchairs. Appalachian Valor. The same foundation that had found Eli Hartman in a waiting room and put cash in his pocket and a federal felony on a 1-page form. The money that bought the guns and the money that honored the veterans was the same money, circling, and it had been circling for years. She drove out to the safe house that evening to put the shape of it in front of Eli, because there was a thing only he could give her, and she had decided to stop pretending otherwise. He was at the kitchen table with Rook's head in his lap, and he listened to all of it without moving, and when she finished, he was quiet a while. "You want to know how they pick," he said. "I want to know how they pick." So he told her, and it was worse than a list of names. It was a method. They didn't take the angry ones, he said, or the loud ones. Those got noticed. They took the quiet ones, the ones who'd stopped going to the meetings, the ones whose checks didn't quite cover the month, and who had nobody left to be ashamed in front of. They led with kindness, because kindness was the thing those men had run shortest on, and a man starving for it will sign almost anything to keep it coming a little longer. "They don't recruit you," Eli said. He was looking at the table. "They adopt you, and then you owe them, and by the time you understand what you signed, you're already family, and family doesn't walk to the FBI." He looked up. "I walked. That's why they left me under that tree." A man who has been used as a tool will, if you let him, hand you the blueprint of the machine, not for revenge, but because being the one who finally says how it works is the closest thing to dignity he has been offered in years. Dana wrote it all down. She did not look at him while she did it, to let him keep that. The storeroom came the next morning. The warrant covered the financial records of the flagship pawn shop on Main, and that was the door she walked in, polite and paper-armed, while the manager smiled too much and walked her toward a front office full of filing cabinets. She let him. But she brought Rook, and a dog on a financial records warrant is just a dog until he isn't. He hid it at the back. A wall of shelving stacked with pawned guitars and power tools, ordinary as a church basement, and Rook stopped in front of it and sat, clean, square, certain, the trained final response of a dog who has found exactly the thing he was made to find. Not the people scent of the hills now. This was the other half of him, the half that knew the smell of gun oil and primer through plywood and drywall and a stack of somebody's hocked memories. The manager stopped smiling. Behind the false shelving, when they pulled it, was a compartment, and in the compartment were the guns that had not gone north yet, racked and waiting, dozens of them, serial numbers that would walk straight back into 4473s, signed by men who had been adopted and then abandoned. The first thing in the whole case she could put her hands on. She stood looking at it and felt the floor of the thing go solid under her at last. That afternoon she finally pulled the recording. Becca Tilley had called the ATF tip line 11 days ago, and the system had kept it, and Dana sat alone in the car in the pawnshop lot and put it to her ear and pressed play. A young woman's voice, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "I think I did something illegal, and I didn't know. I need to talk to somebody. I have a little girl." And under the words, close to the phone, the small, bright sound of a child. A toddler's voice, sing-song, asking something the way they do, over and over, "Mama, Mama," not afraid, just wanting. And Becca's voice dropping lower, "Baby, hold on, 1 second," and then a silence that lasted 3 full seconds, the kind of silence where a person hears a sound, the recording can't, and then, not a scream, nothing so loud, just the line going dead. One small final click, and then the hiss of nothing at all. Dana played it twice. The second time she didn't breathe. She ran the men in the storeroom photos that night against everything she had, and one face came back with a record attached. Shane Kettner. 38. Marines, once. Discharged other than honorable after the kind of incident the file described in 3 flat lines, and no mercy. No pension. No valor checks handed to him in front of a camera. Men like Stroud didn't pose with the ones who'd been thrown away clean. Kettner had come home to nothing, same as Eli had come home to nothing, and somewhere in that nothing the two of them had chosen opposite doors. The same wound, the same cold hills. One of them had been left under a tree. The other was the one who'd done the leaving, and Sheriff Hal Crane, who should have been her partner in all of this, whose county this was, had spent 2 days losing her requests. Records that didn't arrive. a deputy who'd been sent to sit on Becca Tilley's trailer and somehow never went. Becca had called a federal tip line, and 11 days later she was a dead silence on a recording, and the only people who could have known she called were the people Dana had told through the proper local channels. The leak wasn't a hole in her case. The leak was wearing a badge. She drove out to the trailer court that night anyway, fast, with Rook braced in the back, telling herself she might still be early enough for it to matter. She was not. The door of Becca Tilley's trailer stood open to the cold, swinging a little on its hinge. Inside, the lamp was on, and the television murmured to an empty room. A child's booster chair lay tipped on its side on the kitchen floor, one small sock beside it. The dishes were half done. The coffee was still faintly warm. Everything in the room said a woman had been standing right here, doing the ordinary work of an ordinary night, and had been taken out of the middle of her own life between one breath and the next, and that someone had known exactly when to come. The case began to come apart in her hands 2 days after the trailer, and not because she was wrong, because she was right, and being right in the wrong county costs more than being wrong. The pressure came up from below, first. Sheriff Hal Crane had a way of helping that left her worse off than no help at all. Surveillance logs arrived with the hours she needed, redacted for officer safety. A pawn shop employee she'd flagged for a follow-up was suddenly unreachable, then suddenly out of state. Every door she pushed had been oiled shut just ahead of her gently by a man who smiled at her in the courthouse hall and called her ma'am. Then it came down from above. Her SAC called her into a borrowed conference room and laid it out the way men lay things out when the decision is already made and the meeting is a courtesy. The numbers didn't justify the footprint. A handful of straw buys and a dead-end tip line and a missing woman who, he was sorry to say, had a record of her own and a habit of disappearing. It's a county problem, Pruitt. Let the locals work the county. He didn't say Crane's name. He didn't have to. Somewhere above her, somebody Crane knew had made a phone call, and the phone call had become a budget, and the budget was now a hand on the back of her neck, steering her toward the door. "Give me a week," she said. "Give me a reason," he said, and she didn't have one she could put in a report, so she gave him nothing, and he gave her the week with the look of a man who expected to be proven right. Meanwhile, the machine was closing itself up. The buys stopped. The shows went quiet. 2 of the names on her roster recanted in the same flat language on the same afternoon, as if read the same script, and a third stopped answering altogether. Stroud was sweeping the floor behind himself, and he was good at it, and she was running out of road faster than she was running out of will, so she went to the safe house and did the thing she had told herself she would not do. Eli was at the table, where he always was, the maps and the printouts she'd left there spread in front of him and ordered in a way she hadn't ordered them. He had been working. Of course he had been working. She had given a man with nothing a thing that mattered, and he had taken it with both hands, the way you'd take water. "There's a transfer point," he said before she'd even sat down. "Has to be. They don't keep the guns where they keep the money. I rode out to a place twice back when, a stretch of storage units off the old mine road, the kind nobody checks." His good hand moved across the map. "And it runs on a clock. Always the same week of the month, always after the 1st, after the checks clear, because that's when the new buys come in. You've got days. Maybe." It was everything she needed, and she stood there and couldn't take it. And he saw her not take it, and his hand went still on the map. "You want to send me back to my hill," he said quietly, "where it's safe." "There is no safe," she said. "Not for you, not now." "Then why are you looking at me like that?" And she told him. She had not planned to, and she had never told anyone the whole of it, but the room was dim and the dog was between them, and the man across the table had already shown her every broken part of himself, and it seemed only fair. She told him about Jesse, her brother. Older by 4 years, the one who'd taught her to shoot and to bait a hook and to take a hit without crying. He'd come home from his war with his body still mostly working, and the rest of him left somewhere overseas, and the system had passed him hand to hand, a waiting list, a pamphlet, a number to call between 9 and 4, until he stopped calling and then stopped answering. And then one gray morning 2 counties east, he had stopped altogether, alone, in a house not unlike the one she'd found Eli dying behind. She had been 22. She had joined the Bureau because she could not stand in another kitchen and be told that nothing could have been done. So no, she said. Her voice was steady, and her eyes were not. I'm not real eager to walk another wrecked soldier into the fire and call it strategy. He was quiet a long moment. Rook had lifted his head and laid it on Eli's knee. That's the wrong lesson, Eli said finally. I've had a lot of time to think about your brother's kind of mourning. The thing that takes a man like that, it isn't the pain. You can live in pain. It's being set down somewhere and left. It's nobody needing you to be anywhere, ever again. He turned his good hand palm up on the table. You're not putting me in the fire, Agent Pruitt. You're the first person in 3 years who looked at me like I was still load-bearing. You take that back now, to keep me safe, and you'll save my body and finish what the cold started. He almost smiled. Let me be useful. It's the only medicine either one of us has got. Something turned over in her then, quiet and permanent, and the shape of what they were to each other settled into place. Not the thing the world would have guessed, looking at a woman and a man, and the space between them, but something older and plainer and harder to break. 2 people the same wound had made, deciding to be the ones who didn't do the leaving. The power went out a little after 9, a line down somewhere in the storm that had been building all evening, the whole hollow dropping into a dark so complete she heard it before she understood it, the refrigerator's hum dying, the heater ticking cold. Rook rose. She found the flashlight by feel and didn't turn it on, listening the way the dog was listening, and across the table in the black she heard Eli move. His good hand found hers in the dark. He pressed something into her palm and closed her fingers over it. It was metal, heavy for its size, cold from his pocket, milled with a raised design her thumb read without seeing. An eagle, a trident, a unit she didn't know and didn't need to. A challenge coin, the kind a man carries for 30 years and is buried with. Hold on to that for me, he said, low, close. Case I don't come back from being useful. She started to push it back, and his hand stayed over hers, and in the dark his voice was very even. I mean it. I've got my own piece by the bed. Legal, registered, I'm still allowed that much. I'm not going anywhere unarmed, and I'm not going anywhere unwilling. But a coin's lighter than a man, and easier to keep, so you keep it. The lights stuttered back. The refrigerator caught its breath, and in the sudden ordinary glare of the kitchen, they were just 2 people at a table again, except that her hand was closed around a thing she had not earned and did not intend to give back. She drove home near midnight, the coin in her breast pocket, and saw the cruiser too late. Cranes, parked nose out on the shoulder a quarter mile from the safe house, lights dark where no county business had any reason to be. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. He lifted 2 fingers off the wheel as she passed, a small, unhurried wave, a man letting her know he knew exactly where the wrecked soldier was being kept. The leak wasn't a leak anymore. It was a faucet, and it had a face, and the face was smiling at her in the dark. She found out the rest the next morning from a wire the IRS analyst pulled off a number they'd been sitting on. Stroud's voice, calm as a man ordering lunch, talking to someone who answered, "Yes, sir." Clean it out. All of it, tomorrow night, before the federal woman finds the road. The units, the merchandise, and the loose end from the trailer. We don't keep loose ends. A pause. And if the cripple's still breathing somewhere, he's a loose end too. Same night, same hole. Tomorrow night. The storage units off the mine road, emptied in the dark. Becca Tilley, alive enough to still be a problem, held somewhere inside that clock. And Eli Hartman, the cripple, the loose end, the first man in 3 years to feel load-bearing, marked for the same hole, by a man who did not yet know that the agent and the dog and the wrecked soldier had stopped, all three, being the kind of people you could leave under a tree. The call came at dusk, and it changed everything by minutes. The IRS analyst caught a burst of chatter off the wire they'd been riding, a van moving early, the merchandise loading ahead of the clock, and one line that put Dana's foot to the floor before the sentence finished. The Tilley woman rides with the last load. They were not waiting for tomorrow night. They were clearing the units now, and Becca Tilley was going into the dark with them, and once that van reached the road, she would become one more name the hills declined to remember. Dana called it in even as she drove. She gave the dispatcher the mine road and the storage units and the words that mattered: exigent, hostage, in progress. And she heard the answer she already knew was coming. The nearest tactical team was 40 minutes out over Badwinter Road. State Police, the same. 40 minutes was a lifetime. 40 minutes was a van on the highway and a trailer court with one less mother in it. "I'm on scene in 6, she said. "I'm not letting the van leave." She had not meant to bring Eli. There had been no time to take him anywhere. No time to wake a marshal. No time to argue, the storm coming back in and the clock already running. He was simply in the truck because the truck was at the safe house and the safe house was on the way, and he was the only living soul who knew which of the 40 units had the false back and how the lot was watched and when the dogs at the gate were fed. He talked her in the whole drive, flat and certain, a man reading a map he'd been forced to memorize in another life. When she told him to stay low and stay put once they arrived, he didn't promise. She noticed that. She didn't have the seconds to make him. The units sat in 2 long rows off the old mine road, corrugated doors and one sodium light, buzzing orange over a gravel yard. A panel van idled at the far end, back doors open, 2 men loading long cases into it with the bored efficiency of men who'd done it 100 times. Dana left the truck in the trees with its lights dead, and she went in low along the row with Rook at her knee, and she found Becca in the 3rd unit from the end. The young woman sat against the back wall with her wrists bound and a strip of tape across her mouth and her eyes enormous over it, and the moment she saw the badge, something in her broke open and ran down her face without a sound. Dana got the tape free, got a knife to the zip tie, got out 2 words, "Where's your daughter?" And Becca shook her head hard and pointed up the road, away, safe, with my mother, they don't know. And Dana felt one stone lift off her chest even as she heard the gravel crunch behind her. She'd been made. Kettner stood in the mouth of the unit with the orange light behind him, and 3 men fanned at his back, and he did not look surprised, and he did not look in a hurry. "Federal woman," he said. "Stroud said you'd find the road." He had the unhurried voice of a man who'd decided how a thing would end. The unit was a box, 1 door, and he was standing in it, and Dana had a frightened woman behind her, and a service weapon, and a dog, and no way out that didn't go straight through 4 men. She put Becca at her back and put herself in the narrow lane between the shelving where they could only come at her one at a time, and she made the math. And the math was bad. Then the world outside the door moved. A shape tore across the orange light, fast, wrong, too big. And the night cracked open with the roar of an engine pushed past what it was built for. Headlights swung wild across the gravel and pinned the loading van in a white blaze, and Dana saw the men by the van throw their arms up against the glare, and she saw Kettner turn, and she understood a half-second before it happened that Eli Hartman had not stayed put. The truck came across the yard in a long, sliding skid, and it did not stop, and it did not try to. It came in nose first across the mouth of the lot and slammed broadside into the front of the loading van, metal folding into metal with a sound like a struck bell. And it stopped there, dead across the only way out, engine screaming and then cutting to a tick. He had driven it with the hand controls he'd cursed for 3 years and aimed 2 tons of it like the one weapon his body could still throw, and he had thrown it, and the road was closed. There was a beat of pure, stunned silence. Eli's door hung open. He could not get out of it and run. He was never going to get out of it and run, but he had his window down and his good arm out across the frame, steady as a bench rest, and in his good hand was the pistol he'd kept by the bed. Legal, registered, the last thing the system let him keep. He did not aim it at a man. He put a single round into the front tire of the van, and the report rolled flat across the hills, and the van dropped at the corner with a sigh of escaping air, and every head in that yard snapped toward the broken truck and the one-armed man behind the gun. For 1 whole second, nobody moved at all. 1 second. It was exactly as long as he had to give her, and he gave it. It was enough. Rook, fast. Dana didn't shout it. She didn't have to. The dog had been waiting his whole disciplined life for the word, and he went past her down the narrow lane, low and silent, and then not silent at all, and he took Kettner the way he'd been trained to take a man. Not the way the movies do it, but a hard, certain clamp on the gun arm, all 100 pounds of him hauling down and back, and the weapon was on the concrete, and Kettner was on the concrete, and the fight had gone out of his arm before he understood it was leaving. He didn't take a life. He took a wrist, and the threat folded around it, and he held, growling low, until Dana stepped past and put a knee where it belonged. The 3 other men, watching a dog do that, and a wrecked soldier hold a road, and a federal agent come up out of the lane with her weapon level, made the only smart decision any of them made that night. They put their hands up. They'd signed on to frighten the forgotten. This was a different arithmetic. The last gun came from the dark behind the sodium light, and it was Crane. He'd been there the whole time, of course, parked off the road, waiting to do the part Stroud paid him for, the part where the federal woman and the loose ends went into the same hole, and the report came out clean. He stepped into the orange with his sidearm up and his face working, and for a moment the yard hung on the edge of it, because a sheriff with a gun and a story is a hard thing to stand against. He had the drop. He had the badge to bless whatever he did with it. And he looked at Dana Pruitt over the sights, and Dana looked back, and she said the only thing she had. "You knew my brother, Hal." Her voice didn't shake now. "2 counties over, you were the one who said nothing could be done." She let it sit. "You going to stand in another kitchen and tell somebody that again?" She watched it land. She watched the years of it land, every door he'd oiled shut, every man he'd helped the hills forget, and somewhere under all of it, a gray morning and a young deputy who'd filed it and moved on. His arm did not drop all at once. It dropped by degrees, the way the cold takes a man, and then the muzzle was pointed at the gravel, and he was just a tired old man, standing in an orange light with a thing he could no longer carry. He didn't help her. Let the record show he didn't help. He just couldn't, this once, do the leaving. He stepped back and he left the gap, and the gap was all she needed. The hills filled with light a long while later, red and blue washing up the mine road, too late to be brave and just in time to be witnesses. They found a federal agent and a dog and a rescued woman and 4 men face down on the gravel, and a sheriff sitting on a bumper with his weapon already on the ground and his hands already open. They found Calvin Stroud at his home an hour after that, in a robe, indignant, certain there had been a mistake. He told them about the charity. He told them how many veterans he had helped, the dollar figure, the newspaper photos, and he was still telling them as they walked him to the car. Not a man caught in a lie, but a man who had never once believed it was one, who had fed on the forgotten for years and called it mercy, and would go to his grave waiting for someone to thank him. And across the wrecked yard, in the open door of a truck that would never drive again, Eli Hartman sat with the pistol set down on the seat beside him, and his good hand shaking now that there was nothing left to hold steady for. And a German shepherd put 2 paws up on the frame and pressed a cold nose to his jaw. And the man who had been a loose end, a cripple, a name on a form, A thing set down under a tree to be forgotten, bowed his head against the dog and let it out. All of it. While the lights turned, and somebody finally came. Spring came to the hills the way forgiveness comes to a person. Not all at once, but in a slow giving up of the cold, a softening in the ground that you don't notice until one morning the ice along the creek is gone, and you can't say what day it left. The case took the winter to close, and it closed the way real things close, in paper and patience rather than in one clean blow. Calvin Stroud went to a federal courtroom in a suit that cost more than the trailers he'd emptied, and he sat through the indictment with the puzzled, injured look of a man waiting for the misunderstanding to be cleared up. It never was. The case against him did not rest on any single thing, which was why it held. It rested on the money the analysts had followed through the pawnshops until it had nowhere left to hide. It rested on the compartment behind the shelving and the racked guns Rook had found. It rested on a young woman named Becca Tilley, who took the stand with her voice shaking and got steadier with every honest word. And it rested, in the end, on Eli Hartman, who could speak to the one thing no ledger could, how it felt to be chosen by men like Stroud, the gentleness of the hook before the barb. He was not the case. He was the human face of it, the part the jury would carry home, and that turned out to be the part that mattered most. Kettner took a plea. He sat across a table from federal lawyers and gave up the network one name at a time, trading the only thing he had left, and Dana watched some of it through the glass and felt no triumph in it, only the strange grief of looking at a man who was what Eli might have been if 1 or 2 mornings had broken the other way. The same wound, the opposite door. She had stopped believing, somewhere in that long winter, that the difference was anything as clean as character. Sometimes it was only whether anyone had come. Hal Crane came in on his own, which surprised her. He sat down with a lawyer and a recorder, and he confessed the whole of it. The payoffs, the records lost on purpose, the deputy never sent. And then, unasked, he confessed the older thing too. A gray morning 2 counties over, years back. A young man the system had passed from hand to hand. A sheriff's report a deputy had filed thin and close fast because looking closer was work, and the young man hadn't been anybody's priority, and it had been easier to write down nothing could be done than to find out whether that was true. Jesse Pruitt's name went into the federal record that day in a man's own shaking voice, not as a statistic, but as a thing somebody had finally failed to be brave about and was now, too late, trying to set right. It didn't fix it. Dana hadn't expected it to. But there is a particular weight a person carries when no one will even say the dead one's name aloud, and that weight, at least, came off her shoulders and onto the page where it belonged. She drove out to see Becca in March. The young woman had a new place the program had found her, 2 counties from anyone who'd known her old life, and her daughter was in the yard when Dana pulled up, a small bright thing chasing a ball through the thawing grass with her whole heart. Becca came to the door wary, the way she'd learned to be, and then saw who it was and let the door swing wide. They sat on the steps in the cool sun and didn't talk about the units or the tape or the van. They talked about the girl, about the GED Becca was finishing, the job at the clinic, the ordinary scaffolding a person builds, back one board at a time. When Dana left, the child waved at her with both arms, and Dana waved back, and something in her that had been clenched since she was 22 unclenched a little, because this time she had gotten there before the gray morning. This time the kitchen still had a mother in it. You cannot save the one you lost, but the world keeps handing you other people's kitchens, and sometimes you get to the door in time, and that has to be enough, because it is what there is. Eli's house, when she came up the hollow road in April, was a different house than the one she'd found him dying behind. The blinds were open. There was a ramp now where the broken steps had been, plain pressure-treated lumber he'd built himself over a month of stubborn afternoons, and at the top of it the door stood open to the spring air. Rook reached it first. Rook always reached things first now, having appointed himself the connective tissue of whatever this was, the creature who ran the route between the two of them as if to stitch them into one fabric. The dog had retired from the bureau in February, a decision that had involved a great deal of paperwork and one phone call in which Dana had heard herself argue, with total sincerity, that the animal had earned a porch. He lived here now, mostly. She came on weekends. Nobody had drawn up the arrangement, and nobody needed to. Eli was at the stove when she came in, working the coffee pot one-handed with the grim concentration of a man performing surgery, and he turned and said, "Sit, it's almost done." And she sat, and Rook lay across both their feet at once, which took some arranging. The coffee, when it came, was terrible. It was scalded and too strong, and there were grounds in it, and he set the mug in front of her with both the pride and the apology of someone out of practice at the simple act of making a thing for another person. She wrapped her hands around it. She drank it down to the grounds and told him it was good, and it was the truest lie she had ever told, because the taste of it was bitter and burnt and alive, the taste of a kitchen that had a reason to brew a second cup, the taste of a man who had remembered, after 3 years of pouring for no one, how to set a place. He watched her drink it and didn't say anything, and his eyes were wet, and neither of them remarked on that either. People want to make a story like theirs into the other kind of story. They look at a woman and a man who pulled each other out of the dark, and they reach for the easy shape, the one with a wedding at the end of it. But some bonds are deeper than that shape and harder to name, and theirs was one. They were not the missing halves of each other. They were two whole people who had each been left under a tree and who had decided, the one for the other, to be the kind who comes back. She had a brother-shaped hole in her that no one would ever fill, and he had a hollow where a whole future used to be, and they did not fill those holes in each other. They just sat beside them together, with a dog and bad coffee and the door open, which it turns out is most of what anyone can do. She still had his coin. She'd tried to give it back that first week, in the daylight, when the danger was over, and it seemed only right. He'd folded her fingers over it again. "I gave that to you in the dark," he'd said, "for the dark. You hold the dark for me now, I'll hold it for you. And between us, maybe neither of us has to do it alone." So she kept it in her breast pocket, over the place where the worst of her own winter lived, and on the bad days she'd press her thumb to the worn eagle and the trident and feel, through the metal, the weight of someone who knew exactly what her kind of cold felt like and had chosen to stay anyway. The afternoon went long and gold. Rook ran the yard. Eli told a story about the Navy that was, for once, funny, and she laughed harder than the joke deserved, and the sound of it surprised them both. The creek ran high and clear with the last of the snowmelt off the high ground, carrying the winter away downhill to wherever winters go. And on the porch of a house the world had written off, built back by hands the world had written off, two people the same wound had made sat with a good dog between them, and watched the light come down through the new leaves, and were for that hour not forgotten by anyone at all. Mike Hong Chot Motif Juxtin, Nen Tao Bam Theo TL1, Mao Gion Kua Mai Dung, God bless, type Amen. Giun He, Mo, Universal, Hong Thuyet Giao. Muon Ban Secular Huan Tuan, Bo Moin Ha Chua, Thi Noi Mot Kau, Tao Thengai. Buok 6a, Ending Message, English, approximately 352, Kong Icon, Theoflo, Bai Hawk to Bu Tuong, Concho to Vietlam Homne to Lien He, Universal to CTA. This story stays with us because it never asked who was strongest. It asked who would come. Eli Hartman teaches us something the world forgets. A man does not break from pain. He learns to live with pain. What takes him is being set down somewhere and left, with no one needing him to be anywhere ever again. The day someone looked at Eli and saw a man still worth needing was the day the cold finally let him go. And Dana Pruitt teaches us the other half of it. She could not save the brother she lost. None of us can reach back into our worst morning and change it. But the world keeps handing us other people's doorways, and sometimes we get there in time, and getting there in time has to be enough, because it is what there is. And then there is Rook, a dog who pulled against his own training because something in the dark needed finding, who chose a broken stranger and simply stayed. That is the whole of it, isn't it? Not the rescue, not the courtroom. Just a faithful creature deciding a forgotten man was worth lying down beside. If you have an animal who waits at your door, you already know this kind of love, and it is worth more than almost anything we chase. So here is the small thing you can do today. Somewhere near you is a person who has gone quiet, a veteran, a neighbor, the one who stopped showing up. Call them, knock on the door, be the one who comes before the gray morning, not after. May there always be someone who drives through the snow for you, and may God keep every forgotten soul and every loyal animal who refuses to leave our side. If you believe nobody should be left under a tree to be forgotten, type Amen below. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Tell me in the comments, who is the person you would drive through the snow for? And subscribe, with the bell, so the next story finds you too.